In the last episode of Build, we talked about what some of the myths and misconceptions are around UX or user experience design, as well as some of the benefits to having a UX designer on your product team from the very beginning. If you missed the episode, I've included a link to it below this video. In today's episode, we're going to dive into what UX designers can do to stand out and then share how companies can go about hiring and vetting a UX designer, as well as how they can work with software engineers and product managers. So stay tuned. Welcome to Build, the show that debunks a number of myths and misconceptions related to building products, companies, and your career in tech. I'm your host, Purnima Vijay Shankar. Now, if you want to improve your product's UX or user experience, then you know you need to hire a UX designer. But hiring and vetting a UX designer can prove to be challenging if you've never done it before. You might be concerned about how they'll work with your existing product team of software engineers and product managers. So in today's episode, we're going to share what a UX designer can do to stand out, as well as some of the best practices for hiring and vetting UX designers, and how an existing product team of software engineers as well as product managers can work with a UX designer. And to help us out, I've invited Sarah Doody, who is a UX designer and an entrepreneur based in New York City. Let's do a quick recap for people in the audience who may be joining us for the first time. Tell us how you work with companies and UX designers.
Sure. So my business is split pretty much 50-50. I do UX consulting with companies where I help them figure out what to make in the first place and then maybe create that first version of their product. Or if they're already in market, I help them optimize key user flows in their product so that they're converting and hopefully improving the experience and creating revenue as well, if that's part of their business. Hopefully it is. And then on the other side of things, I am very much involved in UX education. And I have a series of courses and programs and resources that teach people different topics in user experience.
So before we dive into some of the best practices for hiring and vetting UX designers, let's start by talking about what UX designers can do to really stand out.
Great. I mean, I feel like I could talk about this for hours. I've been researching it for so long, but some of the big mistakes that I see people make made me realize this parallel between UX designers and products. And I just wrote an article about this, but it's the idea that you need to basically, as a UX designer, think about yourself like a product, because if you're working on a product, that product needs to stand out and attract the right users or potential users. Then once they come to that product, imagine a homepage, they need to think to themselves, I need this. They need to see the benefits, not just the features. And then the product needs to hopefully convert those people into, a user, whatever that means for that business. And I find that UX folks kind of treat themselves and their portfolio almost like a side project, and they try and perfect it. It becomes this emotional thing. And if you can kind of step out of it and pretend that it's a product you're working on, then you can get very specific and make sure that you're thinking about the UX of your actual UX portfolio and, frankly, your whole career, right? Because you need to make sure that that portfolio is clearly communicating who you are and what you do, why they need to hire you, hopefully through communicating some of your wins and outcomes that you've had in whatever you've worked on in the past. And then hopefully your portfolio, resume, LinkedIn, etc., that's leading interviews as well. That's going to lead to some type of conversion event, meaning hopefully you get hired. So when you think about it like that, my students always say man, this makes so much sense. I understand now. And I can kind of, like I said, step out of this emotional quicksand that people get stuck in when you're working on your own thing.
Yeah, I love that. It's really treat yourself like you're a product or a service, and how would you communicate that? So I think that's an amazing exercise, and I hope the designers watching this episode will take you up on that. I know that's something I struggle with too when it comes to figuring out how to communicate what I do and what Femgineer does, but you're right, taking an emotional step aside and really thinking about who your user is and how they view it can be really helpful. So that's good advice. Now, let's switch gears and talk about, for companies, right, who are thinking of hiring these UX designers, how should they go about sourcing as well as hiring them? Where would you recommend finding UX designers, and how do you recommend reaching out to them?
Sure. So the probably frustrating things for people looking to hire UX designers is that there are so many people with UX listed in their resume skill set or bullet points and things, or they've just added it, /UX on their LinkedIn title. And unfortunately, a lot of people are doing this because they know UX is popular and they think it's going to get them hired. So the challenge for hiring managers and recruiters, PMs, et cetera, is to get through all this noise and find those really great candidates. And to me, if I was hiring someone, first of all, where would I look? I would look in my own personal network. I mean, word of mouth, it's kind of like anything in life. Hopefully, you're going to get the best referrals from word of mouth. But if you need to step out of that, I would say that you can look to some of the places where people are putting their portfolios online, like Behance and Dribble and Adobe Muse. I forget all the names of them, but there's so many kind of platforms, let's say. And to me, the challenge is you might see really great deliverables, but you also want to make sure that the person is explaining their work. So if you're just seeing screenshot after screenshot of a wireframe, a user flow, et cetera, and you're not seeing someone address the business problem, the process they followed, maybe just focusing on one user flow within the product and saying, this user flow was the most complex one we dealt with, and here's how it helped solve the problem. If you're not seeing that process and that kind of telling the story of the project, then to me, that might indicate that the candidate is kind of just a person who likes to crank out deliverables, but maybe is not, going back to what I say all the time, not able to think like a designer. And if that person is going to be on your team, and you've probably experienced this, you want to be able to have a conversation with that person. You want them to be able to get on the phone with a developer or talk through a problem with a business analyst. And so if you're only seeing screenshot after screenshot, that to me is a big yellow flag. In terms of where to find UX designers, though, a really great thing to do is to go to some of the very specific UX communities. And so there's communities on Slack, there's communities on LinkedIn, in Facebook groups, things like that. Maybe I can make a list of some of them, but to me, and of course, obey the rules of the groups, but to me, those are really great places because it sometimes some of the groups can warrant a more mature designer, let's say, and sometimes the owners of those groups will kind of have a short list of people that they think are kind of hotter candidates, and that could help, sift through the noise that you as the hiring manager face because everyone wants to be a UX designer today now.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And I like what you said about having them communicate what they do, because I know a lot of times, like you said, people will put up those screenshots. It's unclear, though, which piece they worked on versus like a team of designers, or as we mentioned before, visual versus somebody being UX or even graphic. Yeah. So I think those questions, asking those nitty-gritty questions around their specific contribution can help unearth what they did and how they think about the business. So I think that's a great point.
Right.
Now, I know you have some best practices when it comes to hiring as well as vetting designers. And before we dive into what those are specifically, do you mind sharing how you went about testing these?
Yes. So it's kind of a very ironic story. I think it was probably 18 or 20 months ago, my inbox was full of people asking me to review their portfolios and how do I get into UX and all this thing. And I used to just delete them because it was kind of an overwhelmed situation. I thought, I can't help everyone. But finally, I thought to myself, there's an actual need around this. Like if I'm continuing to get questions. So I thought to myself, okay, I'm going to put on my researcher hat. And I ran a workshop, a paid workshop, and it sold out in something like 4 days. And then I had a wait list of 85 people, all who wanted to learn how to make a UX portfolio. And that is kind of the rest is history, because now I have, 50% of my business focused on educating people about how to create portfolios. And through that, I've had, I think we're close to 700 students through the program. So you can imagine I've seen tons of portfolios, but also I've probably done 100 hours of one-on-one interviews with people. And this is a great tip for any product manager, but I have a Facebook group for all of my students. Mm-hmm. And the chatter that I observe in there is phenomenal research. I see many companies, software companies that I use have groups, either Slack groups or Facebook groups. And I just think the intel is so amazing in there. So these tips are really based off of what I've seen works and doesn't work for people. And I know it works because people have been hired at Home Depot, American Express, Harvard, Google, Warner Brothers, like all these companies. So I get awesome feedback as well concerning what works and what, those internal hiring managers like and don't like, et cetera.
Oh, that's great. It's good to see that you get that feedback as well from the hiring managers and not just the UX designers. So that's awesome that you've done all of this research. So let's dive in and share what the first best practice is for companies who are looking to hire a UX designer.
Sure. So again, thinking about that analogy of UX designer is like a product. The first thing I look for is that the UX designer knows who they are as a designer, has some type of mission statement, personal statement. I call it a compass statement. You can call it whatever you want, but I would be looking for someone that can clearly articulate who they are and what they do, and not in a really cliche way. So when I teach my students how to talk about themselves, I say, don't just say, I'm a UX designer and I like making products that people love or products that people use every day or that are going to change the world. Like, hopefully everyone wants to do that. So especially though, in order to get over the possible confusion of saying I'm a UX designer, I tell my students, say I'm a UX designer and I specialize in and I focus on, I am skilled at user research, qualitative and quantitative research, prototypes, whatever the things that you do are, put them in there so that the person reading your material doesn't have to guess, or worse, so that they don't make a false assumption. And then I've had this happen to my students. They get in 1 or 2 rounds of interviews and then they realize, oh, they want this person to know how to code, or, oh, this person needs to be a master at, like visual design and interfaces and do all the little pixel perfect stuff. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's like preventative. By just putting it all out there in this sentence, you're saving yourself as a designer. And you got to think about the user experience of the actual people hiring you. You make it crystal clear what they're going to see when they look at your portfolio and when they hopefully call you for an interview.
Nice. So on the UX designer, it's creating that sort of one-line sentence or that pitch very succinctly that emphasizes the specific skills. And then for the company or the hiring manager who's looking to find the right candidate, maybe asking some specific questions or sussing out if the UX designer hasn't done this, what are the skills, and making sure if the hiring manager has some specific skills that they ask the designer if they're capable of doing that early on.
Yes. And you know what? It's just popped into my head, but this would be a great thing to do for the hiring manager writing the job description, right? Because job titles could mean many things. And if at the beginning of the job description, they have a one-liner about what they are looking for, that will, save someone having to read through all the bullet points. And if they could just say a UX designer who specializes in, or UX designer who does X, Y, Z, then it's benefiting the candidate as well. You're kind of just doing each other a favor and helping cut through all the noise and assumptions.
Yeah. And I know there's going to take some literacy to getting around that. So
yes.
I will certainly add some videos from your YouTube channel to help the hiring managers that are looking into this. But I think that's a place that people often get tripped up is, well, I don't know, right? So don't worry, people who are listening, watching, we'll include some more links so that you get a little bit more detail. Let's move on to the second best practice that you have.
Okay, so after you have told people who you are and what you want to do, then you have to show them the evidence that you can do that. You have to show them your value. And to me, I always say to my students, you have to think like a lawyer. And when you're creating your portfolio, when you're talking in an interview, you have to make sure that everything you say and everything you show is like a very precious piece of evidence that's backing up that you just said you're a user experience designer who specializes in qualitative and quantitative research and, I don't know, prototyping or something like that. And so that serves as a good filter, first of all, for what you need to put in your portfolio. And again, it helps build confidence in the people looking at your portfolio that, okay, you said this, now I see evidence of that. It kind of all starts to line up like a big puzzle. And so that's why I also say we can't just be showing the screenshots and things. We have to be explaining them, to your point, who did what on the project, especially if it's a more junior person who maybe some of their projects are from part of their educational experience, where there's group work involved and things like that. It's very important to add that context so that people know who was involved, what the project was about, what problem did it solve, et cetera, et cetera.
And for the hiring manager that's looking through this portfolio, because there may be a lot, right, depending on how much the designer has put in, what do they need to be looking for in this portfolio?
Sure. So I always say that we want to, and this is so cliche, but we want to tell the story of the project. And to me, there's really three high-level things that I'm looking for. First of all, me looking at the project for the first time, I need the candidate to clarify, what was the company? I don't know. I may have not have ever heard of it if it's not, a household name. Mm-hmm. So clear, it's all about context and framing.
Right.
So what was the company? And then what was the problem to be solved? How did this come about? And then the process that you went through to get to that solution. And sometimes that doesn't mean you have to show every single step of the process, because if you are more of a researcher or an experienced designer, then I don't need you to go into the details of the visual design, because frankly, that might make confusion and make me think you also do visual design. And then the next thing after the process, and the process is probably the longest part of the portfolio. And then at the end, I want to see some type of outcome or resolution. And if you think of, the simple story arc that you learn in creative writing, or you think of filmmaking or any formation of a great story, there's always that resolution or outcome. Mm-hmm. And sometimes this is a big challenge that I think a lot of designers face. They think, well, the project never launched, or it launched and it flopped, or whatever the outcome was. There's not always a, silver platter result of we increased conversions by 70%. And I say to my candidates, if someone kind of throws you out as a candidate because you didn't have some amazing outcome, then I wouldn't want to work for them, because the reality is half the things I've worked on have never seen the light of day. Mm-hmm. But in the event where maybe there isn't some beautiful outcome, I tell my students to think of what you could have as an insight, like what was a lesson learned? In hindsight, we should have done this. If we had had unlimited budget, I would have done that. So you kind of have to think outside the box if you don't have a way to quantify the outcome. And just a good rule of thumb, I think, is to just try and show some reflection and thoughtfulness as a designer, mm-hmm. not just like, I exported it as a PDF and have a nice day.
Yeah. And that's a good point. So for the hiring manager, then it may even be worthwhile to ask that question. What were some projects that didn't see the light of day? What did you learn from that? Because it also shows that they were able to fail as a designer or be on a team that didn't succeed, and how they deal with that or how they deal with rework. So I think it's a great question for both sides.
I would also say, I think the way that someone responds to that question can show you a lot about, first of all, their ability to communicate, but their personality. Like, do they kind of lash out and point the finger at some colleague or something like that? Or are they gracious about it and humble about it? Because that obviously goes into who you hire as well. And you also want to know that how they may communicate with other teammates or stakeholders and things like that, or clients if you're an agency with, public facing clients.
Yeah, totally. It's a good point, because people often think like, the creative can be dramatic. So if you're looking for those who are, like you said, gracious, even keel, able to communicate in the line of fire, then I think that's a great question to surface and have them answer.
Exactly.
Yeah. So let's dive into your third best practice.
Okay. So this one kind of seems obvious, but the more portfolios I look at, the more I realize people don't think about it. And that's the actual UX of the UX portfolio. Meaning, and you brought it up a few minutes ago, but the length of the portfolio. So hiring managers literally spend seconds. We're talking 60 seconds or less on that first pass. Let's say every Tuesday they review portfolios or something. They are rapid fire skimming through, scrolling through. So as a candidate, I always tell my students, you need to make sure that your portfolio is readable and scannable. And by that, I mean, you kind of have to think of your portfolio, regardless of if it's a website or a PDF, which is probably a whole other episode, but you have to think of it like an article detail page on a news site or a blog or something like that. And if you think of how those are designed, and I've designed a lot of them, but we use a lot of different layout techniques to keep people's attention and communicate key points, such as large pull quotes or making images go full bleed or things like that. Go on medium.com. You'll see a lot of interesting layouts. And so that's what I mean when I say the UX of the UX portfolio, because as a rule of thumb, I tell my candidates, imagine that people are only reading like your titles and subtitles, especially if it's a PDF, just to keep it simple. If they're only reading that top sentence, can they get the gist of what was going on in the project? But also another thing to think about concerning the UX of the portfolio is images. And this is a huge pet peeve I have, but so many times we see people take, like a customer journey map that maybe is this big.
Right.
Shrink it down.
Yeah.
And it's like, I can't even see any of that. So what's the value of that? So an action item could be figure out how to zoom into one specific part of that. Maybe the project was just about the checkout process. Okay, show the whole thing, but then have a little circle magnifying glass thing, all these hand motions, but to zoom into the thing that matters. So that's what I mean when I say think about the UX of your UX portfolio. Even things like readability of text, like if you have a paragraph of 12 lines, break it up into 6 paragraphs with 2 lines each or something like that. That kind of goes back to our initial intro where your portfolio can quickly become this almost art project, and you do it in isolation, and you need to get that second set of eyes and that feedback because you will overthink it. And you kind of need to do some user research on your own portfolio as well.
Yep. No, that's a good point. So let's jump ahead and say that as a hiring manager, you've hired your first UX designer. And I know a big concern for the hiring manager as well as the rest of the team is how is this person going to work effectively with the software engineers and the product managers? So how would you recommend they do this without feeling like it's going to be a huge change? Let's start by talking about onboarding the designer.
Okay. So I am in total agreement that I think you can't bring the designer in and then kind of expect the whole organization to change. What you need to do, and what I tell my students is that UX designer needs to treat that first X number of weeks as a giant research project and understand the other people on the team, their processes, the products, the influencers, etc., and then figure out how they, as the designer, can integrate design into that process rather than just, have a meeting and throw up a presentation and say, this is what we're doing. And so for that onboarding, if I were a product manager, I would spend that first, 6 to 8 weeks maybe, having that UX designer almost pair programming. You do that all the time.
Yeah.
So think of like pair designing. And maybe that designer is tasked with a feature. Let them work on that, but have them kind of pair design it with, the product manager or the researcher, or the other designer might be there as well, the developer. That way, you're starting that co-design process, which we talked about.
Right.
But also, you're letting those relationships build, which are so, so key. And you are starting to build that trust, which is really important, because the moment a designer comes in, especially if there's never been a dedicated designer, it's like defenses are up. You want to just gently integrate that person in. And I think the other thing that you need to be aware of is whatever existing meetings and check-ins you have, I would also include design in that. So if you have, a weekly or bi-weekly show and tell or sprint planning or something, start integrating the designer into that, so that in the same way that I remember on development teams I was on, there would be a show and tell, have the designer show and tell too, so that there's awareness and it doesn't feel like things are happening in a little creative black box over here, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I know you mentioned the defenses going up. I feel like I've been on teams where it's kind of the opposite, where people unload everything on the designer. They're like, oh, great.
Yes.
This is like really crappy. User retention is down. We can't convert from like the landing site to getting people to adopt the product. Oh, good. We have the designer. They're going to solve all of our problems.
Yes.
For a designer coming in, whether they're the first or the second, it's like, oh my goodness, like there is a lot going on here. So how would you recommend kind of setting expectations between the team as well as the designer on, what to tackle over time?
I would say one thing that I'm hearing from my students that are now getting hired, a lot of them are saying things like, okay, I'm in the role and now I'm overwhelmed, or I'm in the role and now they also want me to make Facebook ads, PowerPoint presentations, and things like that. So, or they're in the role and then they're kind of orphaned and they're on like a design island. And so I would say for hiring managers, product managers, whoever is going to manage the designer, make sure that you don't orphan these people. And if you don't feel like you can manage them, or that you've maybe never worked in UX before, find someone else, either internal or external, who can kind of be a surrogate mentor and manager to that person. The other really important thing is to set clear boundaries with the rest of the organization, so that that person does not end up designing Facebook ads and email signatures, because I have been that person. And that is one of my biggest regrets in a couple of companies I was at. Like, I showed those cards and then I was stuck making all these templates and things. And the other thing I would say is, I think concerning kind of prioritizing what the designer needs to work on, this is an opportunity to maybe plug a little bit of research and challenge the rest of the team. Okay, well, you want me to do this. Well, why? Like, what is the impact of us improving this conversion, for the business? And which of these 17 things should we do first? Because chances are the team is getting pressure from elsewhere to fix all these broken things. And then if the designer can almost be a little speed bump,
right,
and say, okay, yes, things are broken, but let's prioritize. And why are we doing these things? I think the question that probably teammates in the past have been so frustrated with me asking is why. I would just be the why person. But I think that's the most important question you can ask. Why are we doing this? Why did you do that?
Yeah, no, that's good. And what does the typical day-to-day then look like? Are they involved in daily scrum and sprint planning meetings? It sounds like you want them to be very invested and just like anyone else on the team.
Definitely. I think without that involvement, it risks that the designer is off on an island, that the rest of the team doesn't have visibility into what the designer is doing, and that most importantly, without that presence, then you just end up with a lack of conversation about design in general. And I think that in those meetings, just through the designer explaining maybe why they did something or why they didn't do something, they are kind of under the radar educating people about how to think like a designer. And so that's where the real value comes in, because I know in the past, in meetings I've been in, I always try and don't just say, well, here's the header and here's the search bar. And well, the header is here because of this and the search bar is here because of these things. And then slowly over time, you'll start to see other people communicate that way. But maybe, let's say the developer will think twice about doing something because they think, oh, well, why am I doing it that way? Or why did the designer, do it that way? I want to be challenged as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. So taking a few extra minutes to explain as the designer, but also the person on the receiving end, take it as, oh, they're not speaking down to you, or they're not trying to overemphasize something. They're really trying to educate you so that next time you can step up and either act as the designer, or you can be an advocate for doing things a certain way as the team starts to grow or as the customer composition changes. So it's a good way to build that literacy on the team overall. And I would say kind of the converse, like it's also good for the engineers to say, here's why we did it this way, or here are the things that we need to be thinking about. So good points overall. Yeah. Now, I know a big challenge is that handoff process. I feel like we could spend an entire episode on this. Yeah. But maybe you can share just a couple recommendations for making the handoffs go smoothly between UX designers and engineers and PMs on the team.
Right. So I think we mentioned this earlier, but I think you can eliminate or reduce a lot of the stress and anxiety that comes at handoff by having the design conversation be happening with the whole team in the steps leading up to that handoff, right? Because then people aren't forced to read documentation. It's the weight of the handoff is less, basically. But to make things even easier, I think, first of all, trying to do more prototyping to show how it would work rather than relying on documentation. And today that is so easy because of all the tools that we don't need to mention because it's so obvious. So
we will include them. Yes.
Yes, we'll link to them. But even just, leveraging the commenting tools within these products and things, it just makes that communication easier, but also more contextual. Even just yesterday, I was emailing a client some designs and I was showing them how to do the commenting in InVision. And they just fell in love with it because they said, oh, I can comment right on the thing. And they could comment with me or with their developer. And then there's no okay, on the bottom left of this screen in this drop down, we would just get it all out of email. The other thing that I think we need to do for handoff is to not treat it like a handoff. And by that, I mean, make sure that after, the handoff happens, the designer is still involved. So as the development team is doing their thing, the designer is being involved in that so that they're able to QA things or give feedback as something's developed. Because in anything I've ever worked on, it is never just a handoff. The developers always think of something, not because I'm a bad designer, just because maybe they know, wait, there's this information in the database and you could display this metadata. Or, oh, there's this new way to do, I don't know, whatever interactivity. And what if we did it this way? Or what if we did it this way because it will save us X amount of hours and you can compromise in the same way that I, the designer, want the developers to be involved. I hope that they want me to be involved to make their life easier as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. So anything else you'd like to share with our audience today?
I think it just really goes back to that idea at the beginning of, UX has so many different roles, so many different titles, and it's growing so fast. And there's such confusion around roles, especially just from company to company. And solving this really is on the shoulders of not just the candidates,
Right.
but the companies hiring them as well. And so you need to make sure that your job descriptions are, first of all, realistic. Secondly, very clear. And you're not just loading them full of buzzwords and things, but the descriptions are a reflection of what that person would actually be doing on, a daily or weekly basis. And maybe just as you're working through your next sprint, be taking notes of where a designer could have been involved, what you would have wanted them to do. That way, you're not asking for that elusive unicorn, but you have a really clear picture of how that person is going to add that value. And then it's going to make your life easier because you will have a filter to, say yes, yes, no, no, etc. So that it really falls on each party's shoulders. I know it's frustrating on both camps, but I think we are seeing a lot of improvement.
Definitely. Yeah. And I know people in our audience are probably going to want to get in touch with you. So where can they find you?
Sure. So the best place to connect with me is to just go to sarahdoody.com. That's kind of my hub of everything I do. So whether you're wanting help with UX education or consulting, you can kind of choose your own adventure once you get there.
Great.
And I tweet a lot too. So if you're on Twitter, you can tweet me over there.
Yeah, I know you're very active on Twitter, so that's awesome and a great way to connect with you. I'll be sure to include the links to your portfolio, your website, all that stuff below this video, as well as some of the resources that you mentioned in the last video, as well as this one. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show, Sarah, and sharing these best practices for hiring, vetting, and working with UX designers.
Thanks for having me. It was great to chat.
That's it for today's episode of Build. Be sure to share it with your friends, your teammates, and your boss. And be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel to receive additional episodes. Ciao for now. Build is brought to you by amazing patrons. Our platinum patrons are Andrea Goulet, CEO and co-founder of Corgi Bites; Charbel Saman, founder of Sprintwell; Dee Gill, founder of Chime On; Jamie Hand, and Lauren Hassan, CEO and founder of Developer, as well as the following patrons. If you'd like to join them and support Build, please visit patreon.com/build. In exchange for your support, you'll receive perks like advanced copies of our books from authors highlighted on the show, special pricing on upcoming FemEngineer courses, and more. Welcome to FemEngineer's Confident Communicator course introductory video series. I'm Purnima Vijay Shankar, the founder of FemEngineer.
And I'm Karen Catlin, a former tech executive who's now an advocate for women who are working in the tech industry.
For the last 22 years, I have been speaking in public, and for the last 8 within the tech industry. I have given a TEDx talk, I've been a guest lecturer at Duke's Pratt School of Engineering, an entrepreneur in residence at 500 Startups, a mentor in residence at Techstars, and was the founding engineer of Mint.com.
I am on my second career. In my first career, I spent 25 years building software products. I started out as a software engineer and over time moved to the executive level, where I was a vice president at Adobe Systems. Now, in my second career, I'm an advocate for women, which means I do a lot of public speaking about diversity, about women's leadership topics, and I've given a TEDx talk.
The Confident Communicator course is a live online course that Karen and I co-teach together. In this video series, we're going to give you a sense of what the Confident Communicator course is and what you'll get out of it.
You'll learn about the challenges Purnima and I have faced learning the craft of public speaking ourselves. You'll learn why we decided we just couldn't keep all of this knowledge to ourselves. And you'll hear from students who have taken the class about how they have become more confident communicators.
You're going to get a behind-the-scenes look at the entire course. You'll meet some past students and see how they went from being shy and nervous to poised and confident communicators. You're also going to meet employers and sponsors who found the course valuable enough to invest in and send their people. And finally, you'll get some sample lessons so you know the material that we're going to be covering. Sign up below to receive the first lesson immediately, where you'll understand why it's not good enough to just be heads down. You need to speak up to get the recognition you deserve. Ciao for now.